Welcome to Backroom Talk.
And we're talking aerobic work today. Have you done any aerobic work today, Carl?
Yeah, we go map 10 to map 1, right? Map 10 is maximum aerobic power. 10 is longer. Shifting up the modality that we're using. Are we using just cyclical? Are we using mixed and cyclical?
Do these activities against a clock and then finish with the assault bike. You get that measure of the assault bike cals or meters across the sets. It gives you like a little bit of a greater insight into sustainability.
To listen to more Backroom Talk, be sure to subscribe. Learn to design personalized programs with the OPEX system of coaching by heading to opexfit.com.
Well, guys, welcome to another episode of Backroom Talk. I am Georgia here with Carl, and we're talking aerobic work today. Have you done any aerobic work today, Carl?
I did. Yeah, I went on a 5:30 run this morning. 5:30 in the morning, not 5:30 pace. Went on a 5:30 in the morning run. Ran about 45 minutes. Yeah. So that was my aerobic work for today.
Very nice. What would you, how would you classify that aerobic work? Like what kind of a pace, what kind of an intent, like what were you doing there in your 45-minute run?
In terms of like long-term or what I'm trying to do, over an amount of time is just get up to like just build more volume. So I'm kind of just like holding paces, holding about like a 7 to 7:15 per mile pace, and getting up to 90 minutes at that pace. So yeah, pace is 7 to 7:15, which for me is it's tougher to hold that pace than it was 5 years ago. No, maybe not 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So it's a pretty good pace for me. It's challenging. By the time I get to the end, it's like, I definitely couldn't do it for another 20 minutes. So yeah, it's kind of just like holding that not quite threshold, not even close to that, but just volume. Yeah, just putting in volume at a decent pace for me.
Sounds good. I did some intervals this morning. I just went 4 sets, 5-minute assault bike, 2.5-minute rest, nice sustainable pace. It was good. I've just rebounded from a sinus thing. So my only goal this morning was to not choke on my own lungs and be able to breathe effectively. So mission accomplished.
Awesome. Good stuff.
Let's talk about aerobic work. So the conversation today is on structuring aerobic work and how we actually put it together in design, why it's important to do so, and then some ideas around what that can actually look like and how to think outside of the box a little bit when you are putting together aerobic prescriptions. So I think a good starting point for the conversation, Carl, is actually just understanding why it is important to structure aerobic work. And inside of that, like, what do we mean by structured versus unstructured aerobic work?
Yeah, for sure. Maybe let's hit that first one first. So I think structured versus unstructured. Unstructured is, in my opinion, just like unplanned, right? Like I'm just going to go out and feel it, right? Which is okay. But for purposes of today's conversation, we're talking about structuring aerobic work. I think it's important to structure aerobic work for a few reasons. One, to ensure that we're not overdoing it, to ensure that we're not pushing something without considering like why we're doing it in progression, right? So if someone wants to get better at aerobic work, you have to think about the structure of that work. It doesn't work for most people just to say like, I'm going to wake up on a Thursday and just go out and do what I feel, because doing what you feel like on a day-to-day basis may not get everyone to where they want to go. So yeah, just considering progression, why you're doing it. What are you going to do today? And how's that different than what you're going to be doing in 12 weeks, 16 weeks, so on and so forth. Another thing is I think it's important to always be able to answer from a coach's standpoint, to always be able to answer the question, why are we doing this, when your client asks you that. I think that's fairly common, right? Like a lot of people that are doing fitness or being coached by someone, they are curious. They're like, what are we doing? And what is this leading to? Not from a standpoint sometimes of like challenging that coach, but just understanding what the long-term game plan is, especially if it's something that feels a little bit monotonous to them. So yeah, always being able to answer that question, why, I think is super important.
Yeah, there's kind of two layers to the structure there, right, Carl? It's the structuring like an actual aerobic day. So what is happening inside of that section, inside of that session, and then thinking about like where does this sit in terms of the long-term plan, and why is doing 2-minute intervals with 2 minutes rest appropriate for this person to be doing today? Because you could certainly roll out of bed and decide you wanted to do something that looked structured, i.e. like some kind of intervals. But if it's not sitting in the context of some kind of longer plan, then it doesn't really mean anything. So 2 points of structuring there. I had just another, and it really connects to what you already said, but like why it's important to put that structure. If we want to manipulate volume and intensity, which is essentially how we drive adaptation over time, we have to have a structure in mind, right? We can't pull those variables if we're just doing random stuff on random days. And for measurement purposes as well, if we don't have some kind of a structure in place and we just do what we feel and how it feels, which might be okay sometimes. But again, if we're actually looking to make improvements and know what someone's doing on a week-to-week basis, we have to be able to measure what they're doing. And if we want it to be aerobic, like in CCP, right, we talk about this idea of pacing, learning to pace, and using sustainability as a measure of, is this person doing aerobic fitness? If we want to be able to use sustainability measures and intra and interset repeatability and things like that, there's got to be some structure that we're measuring that against.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, just kind of what sticks out there is just like progression, right? Like we're thinking about progression as a whole. And if you're thinking about like the specifics, because we're gonna hit on some specific structure like inside of pieces today, but if you're not thinking about the long-term progression, like how are you even getting to what we're doing today, right? Like you really can't, because you're not basing that off of anything. Well, I guess you can. You could just say, hey, I'm going to go and do a bunch of random shit today, and I'm going to structure it this way just because it's fun. Yeah, but I get that. But for purposes of today's conversation, we're talking about like structuring things with progression in mind, like structuring things for a reason, not just to do it.
Absolutely. So let's talk about how, as CCP coaches, we typically structure aerobic work. So what is the structure that is taught to the CCP coach? I'm assuming that some of the people listening to this know this stuff already. And then there's probably some coaches who are not in CCP yet. Guys, what are you doing? Get in CCP. You'd learn this stuff in way greater detail if you did that. So go enroll in CCP. But
yeah, definitely.
Give us a quick rundown.
Yeah. So gosh, yeah, we go map 10 to map 1, right? Map 10 is maximum aerobic power. 10 is longer. 1 is shorter. So in terms of progression, we go slow to fast. We go long to short. We go cyclical first, and then we throw in some mixed cyclical things, and then we throw in some mixed things for the person that it's appropriate for. Cyclical just means you're going to go out for a run, right? You're going to do some assault bike intervals like you did this morning. Just little things like that, right? Like you're doing a single modality, a single cyclical modality. When we talk about mixed cyclical, you're going from one modality to another. So it's like we just like blend our sessions this morning together, and we're like running and we're assault biking, and then we're resting, and then we're running, and then we're assault biking, and and then we're resting. Or if we're doing like a 30-minute piece, it might just be a bunch of running and assault biking in like a circuit format. And then moving into mixed. Then, mixed is you're taking, patterns of movement, like a kettlebell swing, a burpee, some pull-ups, and then you're mixing that either with other patterns, or you're mixing that with cyclical modalities. So you're just like doing a bunch of different patterns, and people would call that like mixed modal or CrossFit, right? Like that's what a lot of people think of when they think of CrossFit. They think of like, I'm going to do a burpee, a kettlebell swing, I'm going to run, and I'm going to do that for 4 sets for time, right? So that would be mixed.
The little, I guess, difference between the CrossFit application of mixed modal work and how a CCP coach would prescribe it when we're talking about structure, though, is that there's always some kind of structuring and progression. It's not constant variance. When you're prescribing mixed modal work using those CCP frameworks, there is a reason that you're putting the patterns inside that you're putting in. You're probably working within certain time domains, work to rest periods. You've got a pace in mind as you sit down and you prescribe. So there's just a little bit more structure and boxing that's happening to that mixed stuff.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Does everyone do mixed work?
I don't know. Does everyone?
I don't think so,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I think most people don't, right? Probably everyone listening to this is like, yeah, I have done or I do mixed work. But if you go and poll, you walk up and down your street and you poll a bunch of people that do fitness and you ask them, what do you do for your aerobic fitness? And you explain like what aerobic is. I think most people are going to say like, I do spin, I walk, I go on runs. So most people don't and shouldn't do mixed work. But for people that are interested in doing that type of work and they're capable of doing that type of work, yeah, they can definitely dive into that, going through that progression that we just laid out.
For sure. And I know we're going to talk like a little bit about mixed work later on and ways to play with that, to think outside the box in program design, but cyclical work can be fun too. Like I feel like it gets a bad rap. People think that if you're prescribing cyclical work, it just means you're doing like 5-minute on, 2.5-minute off intervals, like I did on the assault bike. Like you're just going for a run. There's no like creativity and potential to like play inside of that. But I do hope that by the end of this conversation, coaches understand that whether or not you're prescribing cyclical or mixed work for your clients, you can actually have a lot of fun and get really creative with the ways that you're putting that together. Cyclical work might be like a little bit more limiting in terms of the modalities that you're prescribing, but there's a lot of cool ways that you can play with that stuff to keep it fun for you.
Yeah, for sure. I would actually say you could get a lot more creative with cyclical work than mixed work because outcomes, right? Like we'll talk a little bit about like closed systems and open systems and how open systems are a little more challenging. Like you don't know what your client's going to do. You're just like prescribing stuff and you're like, I hope they finish it about this amount of time, or I hope they do that or this. It's like if you know paces on an aerobic implement, you can actually get super creative, right? And in ways with you, I'm not going to go too far because we'll hit these things, but there's a lot of things that you can manipulate in cyclical modalities that you can't truly manipulate in mixed modalities because there's no measure to those things outside of like how long does it take you to do it or what is the load that you're doing that thing with.
Absolutely. It's a really good point. And like, it's not wrong to program cyclical work following like a very simple structure for forever, right? Like you could absolutely get your clients the results that they want and have very content, happy, fit people prescribing down the map continuum, working on 60-minute, 30-minute, 15-minute, 10-minute, 5-minute, 3-minute, 2-minute, 1-minute intervals, going back to the top and then doing it again with really simple modalities. Like it doesn't have to be fancy, but we're having this conversation for a reason, Carl. Like we both think it is beneficial sometimes to think outside the box and stretch the ways that we prescribe aerobic work. So I'd love to know what you think are benefits or reasons why we should break from the norm and do something a bit different.
Yeah, I think some people should break from the norm. But I think it's beneficial for coaches to understand that there's other ways to do it. And maybe them just understanding that there's other ways to do it. It kind of like ingrains into their heads, like the way that I'm doing it is okay. Or it gives them other options to go to. I think a lot of the time, because you said, cyclical aerobic work might get a bad rap. I think it does, but only in certain camps, right? It gets a bad rap in camps of like, I think I always need to be doing something constantly varied. And I think I always need to be doing something with, challenges through patterns in aerobic work. But that's such a small subset of people in the world. But like I said, I think we're talking to that subset of people. But coaches that are bringing in new clients that have no experience, and let's call it what it is, no experience in CrossFit, they don't give a shit about doing like burpees and kettlebell swings and all of that stuff, right? Like it's so easy to prescribe cyclical only aerobic work to those people because they're not like for some reason connected to these other things. You get someone in that is connected to those other things, and you do want to actually have some progression in their aerobic work. Thinking outside of the box might be really beneficial for those people, right? Because you can kind of give them what they want while still staying true to what you want to give them. So I guess it's just like having a larger understanding of different ways to get, honestly, a very similar or maybe even the same result from a piece of work is beneficial. And, from a coach's standpoint, it's fun to mess with things sometimes. Because I think
Definitely.
I think a lot of coaches have like a subset of clients where they're like their experiential clients, where it's just like they have like a vast training age. They're pretty much good with anything. They have a great relationship. You're like, hey, I want to try this on you. They're like, okay, cool. That sounds awesome. I'd love to be your guinea pig there. I think a lot of coaches have that subset of clients where they can mess around with things with.
You already kind of spoke to this, but I had a bullet down here learning about adaptation as a benefit for prescribing outside of the box aerobic work. And it really does open your eyes to, like you just said, Carl, there's not just one way of doing things to get the same result. And there's some really cool learnings that can happen in seeing what you throw at people and how they adapt to it, and how different people adapt to things differently, why something might work for someone and not for the next person. So just so much cool learning about actually prescribing fitness and how we get fitness results by changing up how you do things. One point I want to make is that I think you have to think inside of the box before you think outside of the box. So yes, getting creative in your thinking around how you prescribe aerobic work is great, but you have to have some kind of a framework and understanding of principles of like just very classic progression before you're able to do that, right? So CCP coaches have this stuff already. They already know it, but I would just do a little reflection. Like, do you have your principles of aerobic training? Do you have a way that you typically progress your clients? Because if you don't have that to then compare different types of aerobic work against, you're just kind of guessing. You're just doing random stuff. So think inside of the box, make sure you have experience actually prescribing simple work before you try and get a little bit more, I don't want to say complex because it's not even necessarily complex, but before you start to change a bunch of variables, make sure you can do the simple stuff really well.
Yeah, definitely. It's like I would actually call it, some of the things that we're going to hit on. They are a little more complex because you have to think about different things, right? It's so easy, and honestly, it should be done with most people. Kind of what you laid out, like the principles, and just like, let's talk about like a cyclical progression, for instance, right? It's like it's so easy to be like, okay, we're doing 10 minutes of work on the rower at this pace. What is that pace? It's going to be 2 minutes per 500 meters. And you're rowing for 10. And then you're resting for 3 minutes. And then you're doing that for multiple sets. It's like, what's next week going to look like? Right? It's like, do we want to just stick at that pace? And do we want to stick at that time? And we just want to accumulate a bunch of volume over like 12 weeks at that pace and master that pace? Or do we want to get faster? Or do we want to decrease time while we get fast? There's like a million ways to do it, but those are all very simple ways. And it's like you can build an aerobic progression for someone for years and years and years using that system. And it's like the shift is like they're going from the rower to the air runner. You know what I mean? Like just shifting up those modalities. So yeah, it's super simple. And some of these things do get more complex because we have to understand the like inner workings of not only their paces, but how capable they are of like pushing those paces, and what is pushing paces to being not aerobic mean for every single person. And it gets complex, and it gets a little bit it gets a little bit risky in prescribing that stuff to clients, because you might over prescribe and they may not accomplish those things, right? That, or whatever that prescription is. And there could be some trust loss. There could be some like, what the hell are we doing? This work isn't for me type thing. And there could be some disconnection from aerobic work where people are like, I don't like to do aerobic work. It's too hard. It's like, yeah, because you're not actually doing aerobic work. So yeah.
Yeah, I'll give a quick shout out to Henry Tirano, who put together a LearnRx class. So our LearnRx subscription-based education platform. Inside of there, if you're a subscriber, you have access to a class called Progressions for Cyclical Aerobic Intervals that Henry put together. It's a really good rundown on aerobic progression. Of course, CCP is like where it's at in terms of a really broad understanding, but to kind of dig into like a 30-minute education piece, I'd recommend going and checking out that class. If you're not a subscriber, learnrx.app, go check it out, subscribe and take Henry's Progressions for Cyclical Aerobic Progressions class. It's a good one.
Was a good one. I enjoyed that.
I learned some stuff. So let's move on to ways to think outside of the box, Carl. Let's get into some examples.
Yeah, definitely. I think the first thing, let's just talk about like things you can manipulate, right? Because I think that's kind of the basis of the conversation. What can you manipulate, or how can you structure these sessions differently? And the first thing that's obvious, it's like you can manipulate modalities. And everything that we're going to talk about from here on, it's like with progression in mind. So we don't have to keep repeating that. It's like, yeah, everything we're going to talk about, think about the person, what they're capable of, and there's a progression that's in mind. But yeah, you could look at modalities and what you're giving in actual work. And we already talked about that, but it's like, what are cyclical modalities, right? It's not only like this piece of equipment that you're on, right? It's also, getting out and, walking up a mountain this week, and then walking up a mountain a little bit faster next week, or walking up a bigger mountain next week, right? Like those are cyclical modalities. So it's almost like cyclical and locomotion are the same thing, right? And then there's patterns as well that kind of fall into that mixed piece. So just, shifting up the modality that we're using. Are we using just cyclical? Are we using mixed and cyclical? Are we using just patterns and cyclical? So there's a million ways to manipulate that stuff. But like we said at the top, it's like the person just has to be capable of doing it and making it sustainable. Because that's the name of the game in structuring aerobic work. Like there has to be some measure of sustainability. You're not just like putting a bunch of stuff in Coach RX and being like, okay, go out and let's see if you can do it. The intention is sustainability. So we've talked about ways to measure that a bunch in the past, but figure out how you're going to measure sustainability and prescribe that stuff and make sure that it's sustainable for the client.
Absolutely. So like thinking about modalities and the ways that we can play with that, and like actually giving some examples of some cyclical gymnastics, weightlifting type activities and the ways we could blend it. What are some kind of go-tos for you, Carl, or some examples you would share?
What do you mean by go-tos?
I guess like rather than thinking about just doing I'm trying to think of a good way to phrase that question. Like rather than just thinking about like an AMRAP of, 3 exercises, are there any like different ways you kind of mix that up, that mixed work?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't hit this yet, but it kind of is like how do CCP coaches structure aerobic work? We could think about mix specifically. We could think about how are we structuring that in design. Like, is it structured to just like go through the work? So like we have 6 exercises and we're just like chipping away at that work. Is it like a circuit format, right? Where it's like we have 2, 3, 4 exercises and we're just going boom, boom, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Are we getting more complex and complicated and we're messing around with ordering? And we'll talk about ordering in a little bit here. But I think, the what's that term with painters? It's like the world is your canvas or whatever the thing is. It's like it's the same thing, right? It's like take anything that you can do in physical expression, right? Like that list is on the left, and then on the right, take what the individual is capable of doing in aerobic work, and anything can go in there if they're capable of it, right? So it's like, I think we can kind of go down the wrong road if we're just like, oh, well, this is a great pairing of exercises, right? For everyone. It's like, well, no, that's just a great pairing of exercises for that person because on the right side, they're capable of doing it. So with a lot of people, honestly, that list is extremely short in aerobic work, right, Georgia? So like for some people, that list is like walking, and then eventually it's like skipping, like jumping a rope, right? For some people, it's like rowing's not even on there because they don't have the ability to row and make that get that like cyclical effect out of rowing, because it's like it's just such a hard contraction every time they do it. So in terms of like what's inside of it, it's just like we have to look at what the person is capable of, and then we just throw those modalities in there.
For sure. I guess I'm thinking about like let's say the person, I'm just assuming they can do everything, right? Like they've got a really good base of patterns and they've developed all of that work in isolation, and now they can do it in mixed work. If I've decided that like mixed modal or even patterns are the progressions that I'm going after, and I'm trying to like wrap my head around some like more creative ways than just being like, I'm going to throw some step ups and some burpees and some assault bike at them just because I know they can do those things, right? I might think to myself, okay, inside of this one workout or across these 8 weeks, I'm going to play with non-dynamic and then dynamic activities. So I might blend some push-ups and some burpees, whether that's like in like actually designing one workout or in a progression across weeks where we're going from like less dynamic to more dynamic activities. I might think about like, can I play with the type of equipment and the loading I'm giving them? So instead of like always lifting a barbell or dumbbell, like more conventional loading activities, could I take them from doing squat patterns with that barbell or with those dumbbells to actually navigating squat patterns with a sandbag, something they haven't touched before? So some more like odd object work. Again, maybe it's in a session, maybe it's across weeks. I might think about like complementary versus non-complementary patterns and pairings and playing with that within a session or across weeks. I may lay out intervals like based on patterns. So I might say, you know, today we're doing squat and push. I'm going to do 5-minute intervals where I'm working that squat pattern plus a row. And then I'm going to do 5-minute intervals where I'm working the push pattern plus an assault bike, and base my exercise selection around those patterns. I might say to myself, all right, I'm prescribing this 30-minute AMRAP. I want it to be full body aerobic work, whatever that means, right? So all of my patterns are going to be inside of it. And I'm going to prescribe exercises based off this idea in my head that I have where I'm like, I feel like hitting all patterns for this person today. So above and beyond thinking about like, what is this person capable of doing? I guess I just find it fun to give myself the challenge of what are some different ways I can then arrive at a decision to be prescribing mixed work.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, you were jumping into patterns. Sorry, I thought we were on the last one. No. So that's good. That's a good transition. So yeah, you could think about pattern splits, right? So let's say that you have someone and you're doing resistance on Monday. You're doing resistance on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, right? And you're doing upper lowers, right? And it's like, okay, I'm going to go lower on Monday, right? So I'm just like rolling with a lower body split on Monday, but I'm doing aerobic work on Tuesday, right? Now you could start to really think about what is that session focused on? Is it an upper focus? Is it a lower focus? What is it, right? If I did a bunch of deadlifts and a bunch of squats on Monday, I may not want to focus really hard and do a like threshold progression on the bike erg or a threshold progression on the rower. Maybe I can do a threshold progression on the ski erg though, right? So like that's an upper focused cyclical day. Or if like what you're saying, it's a mixed day. If Monday was a lower focus resistance day, then maybe Tuesday is an upper focus mixed day. Right. So maybe we're doing a little bit something on the rower, right? It's like 10 minutes, 250 meters on the rower. And then we're going and we're doing 10 dumbbell push press. And then we're going and we're doing 5 strict pull-ups. And then we're doing that over and over and over. You can kind of just like think about those contractions and how those contractions are going to feel at the end of that 10 minutes. What's going to be pretty wiped out? It's going to be the upper body pushers, push and pullers, right? So that would be an upper body focused aerobic day. So, you know, you roll through, then on Wednesday, let's say you do full body resistance on Wednesday and you're like, oh, I kind of hit everything. And then on Thursday, you're like, I'm going to do another aerobic session. It's like, I'm going to hit kind of everything again in that full body aerobic session, because I didn't completely tax anything. Everything's feeling pretty recovered, but I'm just going to go very sub threshold on this aerobic piece. So yeah, considering what you're doing on other days can actually be interesting to look at. What are my aerobic focus days looking at when we're looking at progression and recoverability from session to session?
I like it. So,
so you can manipulate those patterns, right? And even in progression, you can look at like, I want to you hit it, but it was like, okay, I want to do a strongman progression, right? In aerobic work, I want to like do these like odd object, aerobic pieces that are challenging, but you still have to think about what did you do the day prior? What are you doing the next day? And is that the main focus, right? So you have to consider like, what are my priorities in my training sessions, right? Like, if strongman aerobic sessions are the priority, then maybe that's on a Monday and your resistance is going around what you just did on a Monday, considering or assuming that you took Sunday off.
Yeah, we filmed an anatomy of with Doc Rich Ulm, and we talked about mixed plane progression and the idea of like a multi-planar approach to exercise selection for mixed motor work across 8 weeks. And the idea there was just to expose someone to all planes of movement within a given training session, with no like actual progression of like movements from week to week, but again, just exposing and changing exercise selection and giving variation. So you could go down 1,000 rabbit holes of like specific little niches in fitness you want to go after, whether it's strongman, whether it's some barbell work, whether it is multi-plane. You can have a lot of fun inside of there going after specific areas, so long as that person has worked on those areas in isolation first.
Yeah, for sure. Another good example of that, I think, is like, let's say you're doing, 3 10-minute pieces on a given day. And you're like, I don't want to do full body. I don't want to focus on just one pattern or one muscle group throughout these pieces. And we're assuming that this person's doing mixed work. It's like, part A could be, push focused. Part B can be pull focused. Part C could be squat focused, right? And then we can kind of just imagine what those pieces would look like, and the main exercise selections that's in each one of those based on what pattern we're really trying to tax in those.
I know we've been jumping back and forth between patterns and modalities, which is like totally my fault. But I just wanted to speak to modalities a little bit more in something I like to play with is inside of a training session, having like just cyclical intervals and then mixed intervals, and working back and forth, like cyclical, mixed, having the client go back and forth. There's a couple reasons. Primarily, there's so much truth in cyclical work, and especially if someone's a little bit newer to doing mixed work and you want to get an understanding of, are they gaming this thing, or are they actually performing at a sustainable pace? Are they actually doing something they can maintain, or is there something like weird that's happening in transitions and everything like that, where the scores look even, but I don't actually know if their output was even across? Bouncing back and forth from the cyclical to then the mixed work and back to the cyclical, and seeing those cyclical scores. For sure, there's stuff that can happen. Let's not take it as 100% truth, but I just find I feel it gives me at least a little bit more insight into what happened in that session for that client, especially as we begin to introduce mixed work to them.
Yeah, for sure. And as a coach too, like thinking about that concept, you have to, like, if you're designing a day like that, there has to be in the back of your mind a priority between those mixed and those cyclical pieces. Because let's say that you took someone through, 6 weeks of row progressions, and they're like almost at threshold, right? Like they were doing 500-meter row repeats and they're at 138, right? Per repeat. Don't think that you can now throw in different contractions and bounce back and forth and hold 138. So either the row has to give, or what you're doing in that mix work's going to have to give. And that's going to be completely individualized, right? But like, just think about 500-meter row at 138, rest 2 minutes. B, we're going to a 5-minute AMRAP of deadlifts, kipping handstand push-ups, and kipping pull-ups, right? And then we're resting, and then we're going back to the row. It's like, just think about the deadlifts and the pull-ups and the grip and how hard it's going to be to maintain or sustain 138. So understanding, something has to give, and maybe both have to give, right? Like maybe it's 500-meter intervals at 148, right? Instead of 138. And that's something that they can sustain, keeping in mind what they're doing in the mixed work. So yeah, I've used that a bunch too, Georgia, and like just kind of bouncing back and forth from mixed to cyclical. But I would just caution people, like, don't do that and think that you're going to improve your row interval repeats while adding a bunch of mixed work and like interchanging back and forth. Like if the goal is to increase pace on the row, you should probably just row. Or if the goal is to, increase, let's just call it like the ability to work through contractions and mixed work, like that's the goal of the day, you should probably only do mixed work. But if the goal is just like, hey, I want to expose to these things, and it's like, hey, just row at a sustainable pace, I don't even care what it is, there's no like huge progression here, then that's fine, right? But even if there was a progression and you're like, hey, feel it out on that 2-minute row or that 500-meter row, and they row a 148, and then next week you give them a bunch of different mixed work, they may not be able to hold that 148. So I would just say prioritize and make sure that there's actually intent behind it instead of just like giving, because it like we see that a ton, right? Like it looks good, so let's just give it, but there's no intent in mind, there's no like progression in mind, because there can't be, because there's too many variables there.
Absolutely. Yeah. It so depends. Like if you're pairing, like you said, that row with a bending and a pulling exercise versus next week, you give them some squatting and some pushing, they're probably going to do better on the row than they did the week before.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, definitely.
All right. Should we move on from mixed and patterns? Because I feel like I could get lost in this world for quite a while. Should we move on to discussing rest?
Yeah, let's do it. But let's end on, gosh, it's so complex and complicated, because remember we talked about like, let's keep it simple. It's actually really hard to keep it simple when we start talking about mixing in, no pun intended, but like mixing in all this stuff with the goal of being sustainable. It gets really complicated. So that's why it's just like, gosh, just if you don't have to, just do cyclical work with people, right? Like just do that. It's way easier, and it's easier to track. It's easier to progress. You don't have to think about a million different variables. It's like the person putting on a heart rate monitor and thinking that they can make like burpees, box jump overs, and wall balls zone 3. It's like, it's not how that shit works, right? So yeah, it gets super complicated.
Yes, it does. Keep it simple, guys.
Yeah, keep it simple. Rest. As we say, keep it simple. Just talking about ways to manipulate rest, right? Like 3 things come to mind here, Georgia. We can approach rest from a static aspect, where we're just keeping rest static across. So the easiest way to kind of visualize is just like intervals, right? So let's talk about the row intervals again. Rowing 500 meters, resting 2 minutes times 8 sets, right? Rest is even there. Then we have decreasing rest. So row 500 meters, rest 2 minutes, row 500 meters, rest 1 minute and 50 seconds, row 500 meters, rest 1 minute and 40 seconds, right? So it's like something's going to have to give there. And the idea there is that the pace stays exactly the same. You're manipulating rest. So you're closing the gap on threshold. You're going to hit threshold eventually, right? Then we have increasing rest. So row 500 meters, rest 2 minutes, row 500 meters at a slightly faster pace, rest 2 minutes and 20 seconds, row 500 meters at a slightly faster pace, rest 2 minutes and 40 seconds, right? So we can manipulate rest, but it has to depend on what we're doing in work. So I would just say static rest, either increase pace or keep pace static. Decreasing rest, the goal is probably just to hold the pace, right? Like you're not trying to get faster while you're decreasing rest. And then we have increasing rest. The idea there would definitely be also increase pace.
So 3 main ways to manipulate rest as you're writing those programs. I also think about, and this is like kind of to get into like the minutia, but like what's actually happening in that rest period? Is that something we can play with, or that we want to kind of dictate as coaches, right? Because you can just say 3 minutes rest, do as you please. But you could decide that you want that to be a rest walk, where that person is like staying active or doing a slow spin. Maybe they've been on the assault bike doing intervals. They're doing a very slow spin in their rest period. Or maybe they've been running. They walk in their rest period instead of just staying static. So you could play with that. If they're doing row intervals or bike intervals, are they coming off the bike or rower, or are they staying seated on that piece of equipment? So just some little things that may or may not be relevant to manipulate with your clients. That last one, it's really only like, I can really only think of like sport specific reasons to play around with that, and then like controlling variables. Yeah, just some other considerations on what's happening in that rest period.
Yeah, because sometimes we'll write rest, but we never know what people are doing in their rest. And maybe they're changing what they're doing in their rest unintentionally, and they're not able to keep scores, or they feel way different week to week. And you dig into it and you're like, well, what do your rest periods look like? And it's like, well, sometimes I'm walking around talking on my phone. Sometimes I'm trying to find the perfect song. And before I know it, my rest time's up and my heart rate increases because I have to run back to the rower and get, you know what I mean? So yeah, it's a good point on, what's happening in rest times. I think the goal there with most people outside of like sport specific or controlling variables for testing scenarios would be to keep it just as low barrier as possible. Because it could become not rest if we're like, practice this skill during rest, right? Like practice some handstand walks. It's like, yeah. And then your heart rate never goes down because you have blood rushing to your brain as you practice a handstand. So just little things like that. I would just say for most people, just keep it consistent. Like walks are probably a favorite of mine, just because it's like the person's still moving. They're still engaged. They're not being distracted by something else. They're just like focus on that next set.
Definitely. We can also let people dictate their own rest. And I guess what I mean here is rather than prescribing 500-meter row, rest 90 seconds, we could prescribe 500-meter row, rest 1-to-1. So I don't always love this because it's so much maths. Like as a client, like if I think about me doing fitness and how I feel about in the past when I've been told to come up with my own rest periods based on the work I did, there's like this mental stress of trying to calculate the actual rest that you're taking. Do you think that is a good or a bad approach to take when it comes to rest?
Oh gosh, depends on the person, right? But for me, like I don't love 1-to-1 unless I know exactly how much the time is going to take. And then at that point, why don't I just prescribe the time?
Yeah.
But yeah, 1-to-1 just gets a little complicated for people, and they have to think a little bit too much. And usually when you say 1-to-1, someone comes off at 125, they're going to rest 130 anyway. Right. So yeah, I think it depends on the person. But yeah, I don't love the 1-to-1 thing. And I don't love like rest as needed. And we're doing like a bunch of work. If we're doing like two pieces, say we're doing like a 40-minute piece, and then we're doing another 40-minute piece. Yeah. Rest as needed, keep it under 10 minutes. Cool. I like that. Right. But if we're doing the 500-meter row repeat example, we say rest as needed. It's like, are they resting 35 seconds or are they resting 5 minutes? Right. Like that, the variable there could just be so high. So yes, I like to keep that pretty controlled from a prescription standpoint.
And as best practice, like we want to know how long it's going to take our clients to complete a piece of work. And for sure, there's a little guesswork that goes into that sometimes with mixed work. You might not fully understand what the client is capable of yet if you just started working with them, but having an idea in your mind of how long they're going to be working and then what the appropriate rest period should be based on how long they're going to be working, I believe is best practice for the coach to stretch their brain and be thinking about that as they're prescribing versus just, again, leaving it up to the client to figure out for themselves. So that's rest there. One other piece that comes to mind would be like, and again, this is the client determining how long the rest is going to be for themselves, but kind of doing work against a running clock and how that changes the way someone rests. So like, let's say we have a 16-minute clock at 0, and then every 4 minutes after we're going to be doing a 700-meter row. Rest the remaining time until that 4 minutes is up and then go again. The client then has this kind of decision to make. And as a coach, you should probably be giving them some guidance as to how they should approach it. But it's like, do I get through the work a little bit faster so I get more rest? Or do I go at the pace that I am going to be able to sustain and the rest periods stay the same across all 4 intervals? Well, obviously we know that's what we want our clients to achieve. But if you are prescribing those kinds of like work to rest ratios, where at the end of the day, the rest is going to be determined by how long the work took to get done, I think just making sure that that is explicit and that the client understands the goal is not to rush to get the work done to have more rest. The goal is to, again, have these sustainable intervals across the four sets and have those rest periods be exactly the same across the 4 sets.
Yeah, for sure.
What's next? Reps?
Yeah, I think we hit pacing. We're gonna hit pacing now.
Pacing next. Yeah. So how do we play with pacing?
Gosh, there's a lot of ways to play with pacing. Yeah, it's like pacing is one of those things where we could have like we'll go back to the subjective and objective terms. We could have like subjective pacing prescriptions. Sustainable is fairly subjective, right? Like you can gain objective measures from that, but in prescribing it, you're just saying at a sustainable pace. And then maybe you're saying like track X, Y, and Z to make sure it's sustainable. We could say we want this to be at threshold, right? We're sustainable. And then we have to put some language around that as well, and make sure that, when you're prescribing that stuff, people know what you're talking about. Like, what does it mean to be sustainable? It's like you're working for X amount of minutes. You should be able to go for X amount of minutes. Threshold, you're working for X amount of minutes. You should barely be able to go any longer, right? So we have sustainable, we have working at a sustainable pacing, a threshold pacing. We could tell people that we want them to get faster. Kind of talked about that in the row example. So we would just call that like incremental pacing. So you can get faster set by set, or you can get faster intraset while you're doing work every round. I just want you to get a little bit faster until you're unable to get faster. Or I want you to get faster for 4 sets, and then I want you to rest, and I want you to do that again. We have tempo, right? Where tempo is, if we're to, actually define what tempo pacing is, it's like we're going at a particular pace and then we're bringing it down. And then we're going at a particular pace and then we're bringing it down. So that pacing could be incremental. That pacing could be the exact same. That could be like step pacing. So it's just like tempo. You're working and then you're not, but you're working at a lower effort still. So incremental pacing, we're talking about like work, rest. Here it's like work way at a much lower pace, right? So an example would be like, I want you to run for 400 meters, and then I want you to jog for 200 meters. And then I want you to run for 400 meters, and then I want you to jog for 200 meters. And then you can give like percentages, and we can just call those like tempo runs.
Sure.
And then we could also wave as well, right? Where it's like, we're doing 8 sets, and I want you to get faster for 4 sets. And then I want you to bring it back down on set 5 and get a little bit faster than the first set. Or I want you to match the first set, and then 6, 7, and 8, I want you to get faster, hold those paces from 2, 3, and 4.
I'm kind of throwing this one at you, but why don't we do decreasing pacing? And obviously, like inside of those last 2 examples, you're bringing the pace down inside of the workout, but how is that different? And why don't we just go like set by set, go as hard as you can, and then hold on and decrease pace across?
Yeah, I mean, we could probably kind of continue the conversation and talk about examples where we would do that. But best practice, I don't love it because you're teaching people to be slower, right? You're teaching people to go out hot and get worse over time. And that's the opposite that we want to do in aerobic work, right? Like we want to still have some juice, right? So incremental pacing makes sense for a certain subset of people because it's still teaching them to stay below threshold, but like know their gears and get a little bit faster. So it's like, I know I still have a little bit more in the tank. If we're like, I want you to go at 90% and I want you to rest, and I want you to go at 80% and I want you to rest. All we're teaching them is to approach a piece of work in that manner, come out hot and finish shitty, right? So I think it's more in like learning and just like how our bodies respond to decreasing paces over time.
For sure. And then in terms of communicating pacing and like changing up the way you do that, I think it's easy to be like, okay, I'm getting creative in how I set pacing. I'm going to use percentages with my clients for 4 weeks. And then I'm going to use RPE, and I'm going to use all of these different like measures to describe to them what the pace should be. Do these intervals at a pace you can maintain a conversation, things like that. I just don't love playing with that, because then you like don't have this language that you use with your clients, right? I think that's one area where for sure maybe it is appropriate to have that challenge on occasion for someone of introducing a new way of thinking about having a sustainable pace. But if you're changing things up in how you're communicating sustainability and aerobic work too often, the client's just not going to know what's up and what you're trying to say. So I think we don't want to mistake creativity in pacing strategies with just using different words and ultimately like to say the same thing and ultimately not getting the message across.
Yeah, definitely. I think in a perfect world, we would establish that language early and never have to use it again with clients, right? It's like almost getting to a point where it's like, yeah, it's obvious what we're doing here, right? Like, you know what we're doing. Like, I don't have to like put it there every week. I think that's a perfect world for coaches, not to save time or anything like that, but just from like hey, you're actually teaching your clients how to do aerobic work.
Absolutely. There's no comments I love more in Coach RX than like, someone has 10-minute intervals, 5-minute rest by 3 set, and they leave me a comment like, hey, coach, like, look how sustainable I was. Look how my scores were X cals across all 3 sets, without being told that that's what they're supposed to do. Those moments feel really good.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, because I think like language and pacing, or not even in anything, right? Like language and pacing in aerobic work, or language in the amount of load that you should use in resistance work. It's like I found myself like saying the same things over and over and over to the same people. And I'm just like, why am I saying the same shit over and over? Like, shouldn't they know by now? And then I looked in the mirror and I was like, no, they don't know by now, because you keep telling them the same thing, but you don't tell them like, this is what this is going to be ongoingly. These are some things that you need to focus on and look at. And now there's nothing more. Well, I do hate things more than this, but there's nothing more. There's nothing I hate more than someone saying like, well, how much weight should I use here? It's like, whenever I hear that, I'm like, what did I do wrong? That's my fault, right? Like, I need to explain this better. Or what pace should I approach this piece at? But I'm just so lucky in the people that I coach now. I've been coaching for such a long time, and I don't really coach any beginners, right? So I have to be like understanding the coaches that are still coaching beginner clients. But my advice would be teach them early.
Yeah, definitely. I've learned that as well. And it's funny that you said that, because I was thinking about resistance training as you were describing that, Carl. But yeah, things like rep ranges. The first time you give someone a rep range of 8 to 10, make sure you let them know why that rep range is there and what they're supposed to do with that rep range. Same thing applies to aerobic work, right? Maybe if you give them 4 to 6 sets instead of just like a flat 5 sets, let them know why there are 4 to 6 sets and not just 5 sets, and save yourself the trouble of having to write that time and time again. And for sure, it's probably a couple of reminders, but 3 years into that relationship, you shouldn't have to explain why the range is there.
Just use coach notes and Coach RX on Monday. Just be like, hey, this is what we're doing this week. This and resistance across the entire week. This is what I want it to look like.
Yeah, I know.
We're decreasing this, so we're increasing this. And I'm not putting that in A1 or C3 on Tuesday.
I'm not writing increased load for every single exercise.
Man, yeah, but I won't get into that. But yeah, I feel you on that. That feels like such a waste of time.
Oh my gosh. And like, honestly, just like not beneficial for the client at all.
No.
I feel like when you are doing that, like when you are always writing increased load, they're reading that and they're like, yeah, duh. Tell me something I don't know. And probably not everyone knows that, but it feels like lazy coach work, right? There's just better time that could be spent on communication with that client outside of writing increased load 32 times for every exercise they're doing.
Unless you have it in your clipboard and it's just a quick command V.
Yes.
Command V. All
right. Back on track. We are still talking about aerobic work. So did we hit everything we needed to inside of pacing?
I think so. Yeah. And my fault. Yeah. We did go over reps, Georgia. Sorry. You tried to nudge me to reps.
It's all good. Let's do it now.
But I think this one's pretty simple, right? It's like you can manipulate volume, right? You can manipulate volume. So when we're talking about reps, let's actually identify what we mean by that. So it's super obvious when we're talking about like reps that you prescribe in mixed work that has patterns in it, right? It's like, are we doing 20 reps of a squat movement in this mixed piece on in week 1, and then we're doing like 40 reps in week 2? But we could also talk about reps in terms of, you know, how many times are we doing something over and over, right? So the row, I'm sorry, I keep going back to the row example. We would call those sets, right? So that would be the same thing. That's what we're talking about in terms of how many times are you doing something over and over. Or we could talk about reps, and we can correlate that to distance in 500 meters. It's like, are we going from 500 meters to 600 meters, right? Are we going from 500 meters to 400 meters, right? If we're going at 28 strokes per minute, right? Well, let me make the math easy. If we're doing 25 strokes per minute and we're rowing for 2 minutes, it's like reps or strokes, right? We just did 50 strokes in this row piece, right? Like I wouldn't advise people to get that specific and start thinking about how many strokes you're doing in the row, but you can kind of get where I'm going there. It's like, how much volume are you doing of a contraction in a particular piece? And you can just manipulate those things.
For sure. Something I had noted down here, and I think it probably connects like a little bit better to ordering, which I know is up next. So I'm just going to talk about it now because we're going to be hitting ordering next anyway. But when it comes to like prescribing reps, playing with how you're giving someone volume. So you might have decided that you're going to give someone 100 reps of an activity, and that's going to stay static across a progression, but how those reps end up being prescribed inside of that work can change. So we could be doing 10 rounds of 10 reps of an air squat 1 week. And then the next week we could be doing it, 5 rounds of 20 sets. And then we could move on to some kind of ascending, or let's call it a descending ladder. So 50, 40, 30, so on. We could go the other way. We could go from 10 on upwards to 50. So when it comes to how you actually go about implementing those reps and how those are ordered, there's so much fun to be had inside of that.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And then do you want to roll to ordering?
Let's do it.
Yeah. So ordering, kind of what we were thinking about as we were discussing this is just like, how do you order or kind of set up and structure your aerobic pieces? So it's like examples. It's like we can go A, B, B, C, C, right? So remember I talked about the 10 minute pieces. It's like we can go 10-minute piece 1, and then we repeat 10-minute piece. Those things were sustainable. Awesome. And then we have 10-minute piece 2, and then we repeat 10-minute piece 2, right? Sustainable. Cool. And then we have C and C. It's a lot of volume right there. It's 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. That's 60 minutes of work. I guess it's not that much volume, but when you take rest into consideration, it gets a little bit robust, right? So we can order that way, right? So it's like A, 10 minutes of work, rest, repeat. B, 10 minutes of work, rest, repeat. C, 10 minutes of work, rest, repeat. Or we can go A, rest, B, rest, C, rest, back up to A, rest, B, right? So we can just mess around with how we order our aerobic work. Or like, Georgia's example earlier of like, she's going to do a mixed piece, and then she's going to rest, and she's going to do a cyclical piece, right? And then she can go back to the top, do that mixed piece again, and then do that cyclical piece, and then kind of like gauge sustainability. Or kind of going off of our conversation there, or earlier, if cyclical was the priority for that, Georgia could have went, 5 minutes on the assault bike, rest, 5 minutes on the assault bike, rest, 5 minutes on the assault bike, rest, and then go to the mixed piece, right? Because now the mixed isn't going to interfere with the cyclical. So we can mess around how we order those things. So we could do it set by set, or we can mess around with the ordering intraset, right? So it's like 10 minutes of work. We do exercise A, exercise B, exercise C. We're still rolling, and we're doing exercise B, exercise C, exercise A, and then we're kind of just like mixing that up. We'll call that like constant variance intraset, or we can go constant variance as well.
Absolutely. I guess thinking about like in terms of giving someone like one specific workout, let's say we've got like 30 or 45 minutes of work and we want them to get that done. Another thing you could play around with ordering is letting them decide how that work is going to be done. So maybe you have, you give them a 100 cal row, 100 cal bike erg, and 100 cal ski, just to keep it all cyclical. Letting that person know they can either do that work straight through, or they can play around with breaking it into different chunks. I'm not saying this is like necessarily best practice for progression, but it may just give someone an opportunity to play, and there may be some enjoyment that happens in deciding for themselves how they want to break that stuff up.
Yeah, for sure.
What else on ordering?
That's all I had. Just messing around with how you deliver.
Yeah.
Again, this is one that I wouldn't go too deep down the rabbit hole here, because this could just get a little bit too complex and complicated. But it's an option, right? It's something that you have at your fingertips that you can shift up in aerobic work.
For sure. I remember it was right when COVID hit, and we had like a pretty limited gym setup. And I was doing assault bike and row intervals, and I played with just that, right? Like doing them all in isolation. Like I think it was 3 5-minute intervals on the assault bike, 3 5-minute intervals on the row, all in isolation, changing the order. So bike and row, then row and bike, and then interspersing them, bike, row, bike, row, bike, row. And I just remember from like week to week, having a very different kind of sensation and dose, and even scoring based on how those two simple cyclical modalities were laid out. So just something to experiment with yourself as a coach, right? See how different ordering affects you when you go to actually perform those exercises.
For sure.
What do we got left? Measurement?
Yeah, let's hit, I think measurement and time kind of bode well together.
Agree.
So I was just thinking about those systems that I talked about earlier, like the open system and measurement and time, and the closed system and measurement and time. So for example, the open system would be something like for time, for this many reps, for this many rounds, where the coach has to guess, right? Like that's an open system. So the coach doesn't exactly know how that piece is going to end. It feels awesome when you nail it. Plus or minus 30 seconds, but it feels kind of shitty when you're like, oh my gosh, I was 3 minutes off. So that's an open system of measurement, right? It's like, hey, I want you to do this amount of work in this amount of time, right? Or I want you to do this amount of work for time. And we don't exactly know how much time that's going to take. And then we do the same for reps and rounds. And then closed system, that's like you know exactly what's going to happen there, right? You may not know exactly what the dose is going to be. You may not exactly know what their score is going to be, but you're handling the time, right? There's barriers there. So that might be as many rounds as possible, or an AMRAP, right? I want you to do this amount of work in 8 minutes, or I want you to do this work in 8 minutes. You don't know the amount that they're going to get done, but you know that they're doing 8 minutes of work. You can also say on an 8-minute clock, right? So it's like on an 8-minute clock, I want you to do this, 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 and then I want you to do this in the remaining time. Or an 8-minute clock, I want you to do that, and this in the remaining time, right? So that's how it differs from an AMRAP. An AMRAP is more, we'd probably structure that in a more like circuit manner, or like a chipper and then go back to the top and get back through. But against the clock and aerobic work, I don't know, I like using that, where it's like, I want you to do this amount of work and then finish with this many double unders, or this, or as many double unders as possible, or as many biker cals as possible, keeping that sustainable rest and then going back and doing it again. We can structure every minute on the minutes. We can structure every 90 seconds. We can structure every 8 minutes, right? So that's a closed system, but you're leaving some room for because we're guessing a little bit, right? So if I say every 8 minutes, in my head, I'm probably thinking, if I'm doing aerobic work, I want it to take 3 to 5 minutes for them to finish that aerobic work. So there's a little bit of guesswork happening there. but it's closed, and that I know that they're starting their next set at this when the clock hits 8, and I know they're finishing when the clock hits 24.
For sure. I like that a lot. And the example you gave of like, do these activities against a clock and then finish with the assault bike, you get that measure of the assault bike cals or meters across the sets. That gives you like a little bit of a greater insight into sustainability. There's no hiding there. On measurement specifically, how do you decide whether you're going to give someone calories or meters or strokes per minute or RPMs when you are prescribing like cyclical aerobic work?
Oh man, good question. Usually for me, it's based on the data that I have.
Mm-hmm.
Like if I don't have a pace, like if I don't, obviously we can reverse engineer, right? Like we can look at pace per 500 meters and correlate that to calories, right? Calories per hour. We could look at, average RPM and correlate that to pace per mile or kilometer on the assault bike, so on and so forth. But usually that has a lot to do with what I've used with them in the past, because if you tell someone 1,050 calories per hour and they've never worked in calories per hour, that's going to be a challenge for them, because they're not going to know like the intricacy of like, oh, if I pull this much, or if I pedal on the bike this hard, this is how I get to 1,050. So it's usually their experiences and what they've used and the data that I have on them. And sometimes it's a fun little experiment to just change it up on someone and say, I want you to hold this many calories per hour, this many meters per 500 or 1,000 meters. So yeah, I think it depends a lot on just what I have in my fingertips in terms of data and what their experiences are.
Yeah, I completely agree there, Carl.
And I'll add, to finish that thought, aesthetics matter a lot to me. So the way that something looks really matters. Like, because if I see a bunch of numbers, I know it's work and it doesn't actually matter the way that it looks, but there's something in me that doesn't like to see something that doesn't have like a pattern or that doesn't make sense.
Oh my gosh, I completely agree.
So yeah, I probably waste a little bit too much time making things look good and make sense, right? Because like, and the way that I like, the way that I tell myself that I'm doing the right thing is like, I'm like, oh, when, they're doing work, I don't want them to have to think about what's next. There's like some pattern there where it's like, but it's probably not that. It's probably just me and my eyes and me having everything having to be in perfect order.
Completely am with you on that. And I do think that that's a thoughtful consideration for your clients to help them remember the work they're doing. And by giving them a little bit of a pattern to follow in reps or cals or meters, whatever you are prescribing. Any last thoughts on measurement and time?
No, I think that's good there for me.
So that was structuring aerobic work, guys. Again, any final thoughts on that and the topic as a whole, Carl, that you want to leave the listeners with?
With most of your people, just forget everything we said. It's a nice little listen to kind of stretch our brains a little bit. But yeah, for most of your people, forget what we said and just do aerobic work, cyclical aerobic work with people. And, make sure that you have progression in mind and make it as easy as possible on yourself and your client, because as easy as possible is going to be probably the most consistent thing in terms of the structure that you give and the progressions that you use.
For sure. And I'll just remind everyone that, again, to kind of think outside of the box and get creative, you've got to have your principles and your order and thoughts to follow first. And if you're not in CCP, we teach that stuff there, right? We give you guys so many great frameworks around program design and progression so that you have this like strong, robust base of understanding how to progress aerobic work, anaerobic work, resistance training, all of the above. And then with that base, that is where through time and experience, you get to have fun and get to be a little bit more creative, but have the basics first. Go ahead, apply to CCP. I'll make sure that there is a link in the description for you to be able to do that. And as always, we would love to have you in our next cohort. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.